Preaching morality on the newsstands, but deep within the lower decks of his superyacht, billionaire Malcolm Forbes weaponized his wealth to buy the bodies of young men, then coldly left them to die in the AIDS plague just to protect his spotless facade. This sickening betrayal is exactly what Malcolm Forbes never wanted you to know about his darkest secrets. How was such a filthy illusion perfectly concealed right up until the very second he drew his last breath? The genesis of this grand deception begins long before he entered the boardrooms of New York. Born in 1919, Malcolm Stevenson Forbes inherited a surname that functioned as a heavy, gilded shackle. His father, B.C. Forbes, was a formidable Scottish immigrant who built a publishing empire entirely on the gospel of rugged individualism and unapologetic grit. B.C. was a man of the old world, a strict Presbyterian patriarch who categorized vulnerability as a moral failing and demanded unyielding, aggressive strength from his heirs. He wrote syndicated columns praising the ruthless efficiency of industrial titans, establishing a household culture where sentimentality was eradicated and financial ambition was the sole recognized currency. Malcolm, the third of four sons, recognized early that he did not naturally embody the rugged alpha male ideal his father worshipped. He possessed a sensitive, distinctly artistic temperament, drawn heavily to aesthetics, literature, and the quiet observation of art, traits entirely at odds with the brutal financial mechanics of the family business. This early disconnect forged his fatal weakness. It planted an insatiable, almost pathological need for validation from the very masculine establishment that fundamentally terrified him. Every major decision, every grand public gesture for the next 7 decades stems directly from this singular, unhealed psychological wound. He realized in his youth that surviving the intense, unforgiving scrutiny of the Forbes dynasty required the complete suppression of his natural instincts. He had to construct an impenetrable avatar of acceptable manhood. He began mimicking the cadence of power, adopting a forced gruffness and a hyper-competitive streak to mask an internal, constant panic. The pressure was physical. It manifested in a desperate drive to prove his worth through tangible, undeniable achievements that his father could quantify, measure, and respect. This desperate pursuit of absolute validation found its first major crucible in the theater of the Second World War. When the global conflict erupted, the young Forbes heir possessed ample family influence to easily secure a comfortable, heavily protected administrative posting in Washington, D.C. He chose the exact opposite path. He enlisted directly into the infantry, plunging into the brutal, muddy reality of the European theater as a heavy machine gunner. He served with undeniable distinction as a staff sergeant in the 84th Infantry Division. During the harrowing Battle of Aachen in late 1944, amidst freezing rain and relentless artillery fire, he sustained a severe thigh wound, spending months in military hospitals recovering. The United States government awarded him the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart. Historical records indicate his bravery in Germany was genuine. Yet, the medals he brought home eventually served a profound secondary purpose. For the rest of his public life, that Purple Heart became his ultimate, unassailable defense mechanism. Whenever his dedication to traditional American values faced questioning by political rivals, or whenever a whisper of doubt arose regarding his toughness in the vicious circles of New York finance, he possessed a literal shield of brass and ribbon to present to his detractors. It functioned as the first thickest layer of armor in a suit he would spend the rest of his life welding shut. He returned from the war a decorated hero, a man whose masculinity and physical courage had been violently and officially certified. He had survived the artillery of the Axis powers. However, as he prepared to take his designated place within his father's publishing empire, he was about to discover that the battlefields of Europe were remarkably straightforward compared to the suffocating paranoid trenches of post-war corporate America. Post-war America offered no sanctuary for a man carrying his specific secrets. The late 1940s and the dawn of the 1950s represented the absolute zenith of the American organization man, an era where strict social conformity acted as the supreme currency of power. Wall Street operated under a rigid, unspoken code demanding absolute adherence to the heterosexual, suburban family ideal. The political climate was turning fiercely hostile. The impending Lavender Scare, running parallel to the anti-communist purges of McCarthyism, would soon systematically eradicate thousands of individuals from government and corporate structures based solely on the suspicion of homosexuality. Malcolm Forbes walked directly into this paranoid, hyper-masculine arena, carrying a truth capable of instantly obliterating his family name, stripping his wealth, and destroying his entire social standing. He recognized immediately that a Forbes could never achieve true invisibility. He was a highly public figure, an heir to a rapidly growing media syndicate. He was forced to hide in plain sight. The solution required constructing a domestic fortress just as impenetrable as his military record. In 1946, he married Roberta Remsen Laidlaw. Over the following years, they produced 5 children, perfectly cementing the image of the prolific traditional patriarch. This marriage provided the ultimate suburban shield. Behind the heavy oak doors of their sprawling New Jersey estate, Timberfield, the physical and emotional distance between husband and wife expanded quietly. Yet, in the society pages and the glossy spreads of lifestyle magazines, the facade remained entirely flawless. He deployed the family unit as a calculated corporate asset. It served as a visible, ironclad guarantee to the conservative banking establishment that the heir to the Forbes publishing empire was safe, predictable, and fundamentally aligned with their strict moral parameters. The psychological endurance required for this daily performance was immense. He was actively publishing a magazine that celebrated the very men who would have eagerly destroyed him. Every morning, he put on a bespoke suit, kissed his wife goodbye, and commuted to Manhattan to sit at the head of a boardroom filled with men who casually traded homophobic slurs over scotch and cigars. He had to lead this environment. He had to laugh at the jokes, enforce the culture, and project an aura of absolute, unwavering heterosexual dominance. The strain of maintaining 2 entirely separate, deeply conflicting realities began to manifest in an intense physical restlessness. He found quiet moments deeply terrifying. Silence allowed the immense cognitive dissonance to surface. He required constant forward motion, constant mechanical noise, and constant public spectacle to drown out the reality of his own suppressed existence. This restless energy drove his initial foray into politics. He launched campaigns for the New Jersey State Senate, securing a seat and eventually making a highly publicized, though unsuccessful, run for governor in 1957. Political life in the 1950s demanded a flawless public morality. He subjected himself to the brutal, invasive scrutiny of the press and political opponents, essentially daring them to find a flaw in his constructed persona. It was a high-wire act performed without a net. The political campaigns failed to secure the governorship, but they succeeded brilliantly in their true, unspoken objective. They permanently cemented his public image as a pillar of the Republican establishment, a devoted family man and a fiercely patriotic conservative. The architecture of the LIWW as now fully established. He possessed the war medals, the wife, the 5 children, and the political pedigree. Up to this point, the performance aligned perfectly with the standard, albeit highly stressful, expectations of a mid-century corporate titan. He had successfully built the walls. But as the restrictive 1950s gave way to the turbulent cultural shifts of the 1960s, he assumed total control of Forbes magazine. The stakes were suddenly magnified. He was no longer just an heir, he was the sole architect of the capitalist Bible. Upon assuming total control, he gripped the mask even tighter. He pushed the performance of his masculinity from mere conformity into a realm of spectacular, aggressive theater. As the 1960s bled into the 1970s, the cultural fabric of the United States began to violently unravel. The counterculture movement, the sexual revolution, and the anti-war protests systematically dismantled the rigid gray flannel conformity of the previous decade. For many, this era represented a profound, long-awaited liberation. But for Malcolm Forbes, this sudden loosening of societal rules did not offer freedom. It presented an absolute existential threat. The unwritten codes of Wall Street, however, remained fiercely resistant to this cultural shift. The financial establishment doubled down on its conservative bedrock, viewing the social upheaval outside their boardroom windows with deep suspicion and hostility. Malcolm was now the sole commander of Forbes magazine, having successfully positioned it as the unapologetic mouthpiece for this exact brand of hardline, traditional capitalism. He had trapped himself. He was a man harboring a life-destroying secret, sitting at the absolute pinnacle of an industry that demanded total moral and heterosexual purity. He realized that simply blending in was no longer a viable survival strategy. The standard suburban camouflage of his New Jersey estate and his 5 children was no longer sufficient to deflect the increasingly invasive glare of the modern media. He required a thicker, louder, and significantly more aggressive layer of armor. He decided to weaponize his own masculinity, pushing his public performance out of the realm of mere conformity and into a spectacular, almost absurd theater of the extreme. This conscious escalation birthed a highly calculated, desperate obsession with Harley-Davidson motorcycles. The visual contradiction he engineered was blindingly stark and incredibly effective. Malcolm Forbes, fast approaching his 60s and publishing the definitive capitalist Bible, would stand outside a glass and steel Manhattan skyscraper. He strips off a bespoke $1,000 Savile Row suit jacket and replaces it with a heavy, scuffed black leather jacket prominently emblazoned with the Forbes corporate logo. He militarized his weekend rides. He formed a highly exclusive, tightly controlled motorcycle gang composed entirely of his top corporate executives and trusted political allies, audaciously naming them the capitalist tools. The physical manifestation of this performance is crucial to understanding its psychological utility. When he led the capitalist tools down an interstate highway, riding in a tight, disciplined V formation, the sheer deafening roar of the heavy engines provided a perfect, impenetrable acoustic shield. The vibration of the machinery and the aggressive outlaw aesthetics of the leather and chrome completely drowned out any internal anxiety and effectively silenced any external whispers. If you saw a millionaire leading a biker gang through the American heartland, projecting an aura of raw, gritty physical dominance, your immediate assumption was not to question his sexuality. The mask was a masterpiece of misdirection. He was actively taking the ultimate symbol of working-class rebellion and countercultural freedom, and explicitly using it to police and reinforce the most sterile, exclusive conservative norms of the financial elite. It would be as an astonishing act of psychological diversion. He forced his executives, many of whom were terrified of the heavy machines, to ride alongside him, transforming their fear into a daily public validation of his own dominant masculinity. He fed the mainstream media an absolutely irresistible narrative. They eagerly consumed the image of the swashbuckling, red-blooded billionaire adventurer, willingly blinding themselves to anything beyond the polished chrome and the exhaust fumes. However, the ground eventually proved insufficient for his grand, desperate diversions. The interstate highways still kept him too close to the scrutinizing eyes of the establishment. He felt a profound, terrifying compulsion to conquer the sky. He began pouring millions of dollars into the pursuit of hot air ballooning. Again, these ascensions were orchestrated as massive public spectacles, combining maximum visibility with the illusion of genuine physical danger. He purchased the historic Château de Balleroy in Normandy, France, transforming the sprawling aristocratic estate into a dedicated museum and a theatrical launching ground for his fleet of massive, custom-designed balloons. He commissioned balloons shaped like the Forbes magazine headquarters, like the Sphinx, and like a massive floating Harley-Davidson. These ascensions were meticulously planned, heavily photographed media events. He would position himself in the small wicker basket, wearing his leather jacket or a bright customized flight suit, waving magnanimously to the thousands of spectators gathered below. He projected the flawless image of a triumphant, daring pioneer commanding the elements. But the issue here is not the altitude he achieved. The issue is the psychological distance he was desperately trying to buy. The higher he flew above the ground, the further away he felt from the dangerous whispering gossip columns of New York high society. The sheer physical scale of the balloons demanded immediate awe and completely short-circuited critical thought. The public looked up and saw a fearless adventurer. What they were actually witnessing was a terrified man running as far away from his own shadow as physics and millions of dollars would allow. His fatal weakness, that unyielding, pathetic need for the establishment's applause, was temporarily satisfied by the cheering crowds. He became deeply, dangerously addicted to the public validation his engineered persona received, fatally mistaking the loud applause for actual safety. Yet the motorcycles and the hot air balloons served merely as the loud, public-facing exterior of his elaborate defense system. They were the bright flares shot into the sky to distract the enemy. The dark, heavily guarded heart of his carefully constructed empire was entirely aquatic, resting on the teak decks of his legendary series of superyachts known as the Highlander. To the casual observer, the yacht was the ultimate floating symbol of corporate triumph. It was a maritime palace equipped with a helipad, a specialized garage for his motorcycles, and customized display cases housing his priceless collection of Imperial Fabergé eggs. By day, the Highlander functioned as the supreme boardroom. Malcolm hosted presidents, prime ministers, and the most lethal predators of Wall Street for heavily publicized, sun-drenched afternoon cruises around Manhattan. He served them vintage champagne and dictated the future of American commerce. But when the corporate guests departed, the sun set over the Hudson River, and the official entertaining concluded, the vessel underwent a chilling transformation. The yacht ceased to be a place of leisure and became a strictly controlled, highly sanitized sovereign state, where his capital dictated the absolute laws of reality. Witnesses, former crew members, and security personnel would later detail an astonishingly efficient, almost military-grade protocol of isolation. The vast wealth did not purchase freedom for Malcolm Forbes. It purchased an incredibly expensive floating panic room. A secondary, highly covert logistical operation commenced under the cover of darkness. Young, attractive male companions, frequently sourced through discreet, heavily compensated networks, did not stroll up the brightly lit main gangway. They were ferried out to the yacht via private, unmarked tenders. They slipped through lower deck entrances and service doors in the dead of night, expertly routed away from the prying lenses of the paparazzi and the lethal gossip circuits of the financial district. The tragedy lay in the transactional, sterile nature of the arrangement. It reveals the catastrophic, soul-crushing damage inflicted by his fatal weakness. His insatiable terror of losing his enthroned position at the pinnacle of conservative American society completely paralyzed his ability to experience genuine, equal human intimacy. He weaponized his immense fortune to ensure his desires remained strictly off the books, managed and mitigated like a volatile corporate liability. Every single individual on board that vessel, from the heavily vetted security guards to the young men themselves, was bound by the unspoken ironclad contract of his wealth. He bought their silence with cash, luxury, and the implicit threat of his power. But in purchasing their silence, he bought his own absolute suffocating isolation. Inside the master suite of a multi-million-dollar yacht, surrounded by priceless Russian antiquities and paid companions, he sat with an absolute certainty. If the sun rose on a leaked truth, his entire empire would instantly evaporate. He was the most powerful man in the room, yet he was utterly held hostage by his own guest list. The Fabergé eggs sitting quietly in their bulletproof glass cases throughout the yacht were no longer just art. They served as the perfect, terrifying visual metaphor for his own existence. They were exquisitely crafted, flawlessly presented to the world, yet completely hollowed out by fear on the inside. This elaborate, highly funded architecture of secrecy allowed him to survive the 1970s. But as the decade turned, the cultural landscape of America shifted violently once again, bringing a reckoning he could not outrun on a motorcycle or float above in a balloon. The dawn of the 1980s ushered in the Reagan era, an environment defined by a fierce, uncompromising resurgence of traditional hardline conservative values. Forbes magazine, under Malcolm's unwavering and aggressive direction, became the undisputed loud Bible of this new decade. He championed the aggressive, deregulated pursuit of capital, cementing his position as the high priest of the greed is good generation. The magazine celebrated and validated the very political and financial establishment that was actively, structurally hostile to any deviation from the heterosexual norm. He was riding the absolute crest of this conservative financial wave, his influence reaching directly into the Oval Office. But while he was celebrating the triumph of unrestrained capitalism, a devastating, terrifying storm was gathering just blocks away from his Fifth Avenue headquarters. The AIDS epidemic struck New York City with apocalyptic force. It ravaged the gay community, leaving a trail of unimaginable physical agony, grief, and terror. Men were dying in the thousands, abandoned by their families, and ignored by their government. This is the precise moment where the psychological pressure on Malcolm Forbes escalated from mere paranoia to a grotesque, unforgivable moral crisis. During this period, Forbes wielded unparalleled media influence. He possessed the financial resources to single-handedly fund massive medical research initiatives. He held direct, unfettered access to the highest echelons of the White House and the conservative political machine. Yet, as the very community he secretly engaged with in the dark was being systematically decimated in the light, he remained violent, aggressively silent. To speak out, to advocate for research funding, or to even acknowledge the humanity of the victims would be to draw the eye of the establishment directly towards his own carefully guarded closet. His fatal weakness, his absolute consuming terror of losing his elite status and the approval of his peers, completely obliterated any trace of human solidarity. He made a calculated, chilling boardroom decision to protect his brand and his wealth over the lives of thousands of dying men. He continued to publish magazines praising the politicians who were actively blocking public health funding. The hypocrisy was no longer just a personal failing. It had become a lethal, systemic complicity. However, the sheer, unavoidable scale of the health crisis, combined with his own advancing age and an increasingly reckless pattern of private behavior, meant that the protective walls were beginning to crack. The whispers in the media, long suppressed by his wealth and PR machine, were growing louder and more persistent. The carefully maintained eccentric bachelor billionaire narrative was rapidly fraying at the edges. The press was getting hungry, and the questions were becoming harder to deflect with just a leather jacket and a smile. He realized with terrifying clarity that the motorcycles and the yachts were no longer enough to hold back the tide. He needed a distraction of unprecedented global magnitude. He required a public relations masterstroke so blindingly glamorous, so universally captivating, that it would permanently short-circuit the media's critical faculties and silence the rumors once and for all. And as he surveyed the landscape for a solution, he realized that the only thing powerful enough to protect the ultimate capitalist tool was the ultimate Hollywood royalty. The stage was set for the most audacious, expensive, and profoundly cynical manipulation of the American public he had ever attempted. The solution to his escalating terror arrived from the glittering hills of Hollywood. By the mid-1980s, Elizabeth Taylor was no longer merely a cinema icon. She had transformed herself into a fierce, formidable political force. The devastating death of her close friend Rock Hudson in 1985 from AIDS-related complications had violently awakened her to the horrific reality of the epidemic. She weaponized her unparalleled global fame, pivoting from screen siren to relentless activist, helping to establish the American Foundation for AIDS Research, or AMFAR. However, she faced a monumental obstacle. The disease carried a suffocating, lethal stigma. The conservative political establishment led by the Reagan White House was actively ignoring the crisis, and the traditional corporate avenues for charitable fundraising were firmly, aggressively closed to her. She possessed the spotlight, but she desperately required capital. Massive, undeniable capital. Across the country, sitting in his Fifth Avenue headquarters, Malcolm Forbes observed this dynamic with the calculating, ruthless precision of an apex predator identifying the perfect symbiotic opportunity. The rumors surrounding his own private life were calcifying from quiet whispers into accepted, albeit unspoken facts within the elite circles of New York. The eccentric bachelor narrative was wearing dangerously thin for a man rapidly approaching his 70s. He required a public relations miracle. He needed a shield so blindingly radiant that it would permanently burn the eyes of anyone attempting to look past it. The subsequent relationship between Malcolm Forbes and Elizabeth Taylor operated less like a late-in-life romance and more like a highly orchestrated billion-dollar corporate merger of two public personas. It was a transaction of unparalleled strategic brilliance. She provided the ultimate, indisputable heterosexual camouflage. He provided the limitless golden checkbook. They forged an alliance that would thoroughly manipulate the global media for the remainder of the decade. The execution of this pantomime was heavily orchestrated, leaving nothing to chance. Their relationship became a relentless, highly visible tour of global dominance. They appeared together on the covers of magazines. They held court at the most exclusive galas at the Waldorf Astoria, and they arrived at premieres flanked by phalanxes of security and screaming paparazzi. He was the rugged, immensely wealthy captain of industry. She was the violet-eyed goddess of the silver screen. Together they fed the American public a narrative so intoxicating, so drenched in traditional glamour and wealth, that it completely short-circuited any critical journalistic inquiry. Their public appearances pushed his desperate need for acceptable masculinity to its extreme zenith. He weaponized his immense wealth to create undeniable visual spectacles. The most glaring example of this was the presentation of the purple passion Harley-Davidson. In a carefully staged photo opportunity, Malcolm Forbes, draped in his signature black leather jacket, grinned broadly while presenting Elizabeth Taylor with a massive custom-built motorcycle painted entirely in a deep amethyst designed to precisely match the color of her famous eyes. The imagery is violently contradictory and entirely deliberate. He was taking a heavy, thundering machine synonymous with aggressive male dominance and gifting it to the world's most desired woman, while the cameras of the global press corps furiously documented every angle. It was a visual weapon designed to obliterate nuance. If you saw the publisher of the Capitalist Bible straddling a Harley alongside Elizabeth Taylor, the sheer wattage of the celebrity completely blinded you to the shadows lurking just out of frame. But the plot twist here does not lie in the fake romance. It lies in the devastating silent complicity of the media establishment. The journalists of the 1980s were not stupid. The prominent gossip columnists of New York, the very people whose careers depended on unearthing the hidden truths of the elite, knew precisely what was happening on the lower decks of the Highlander. They were acutely aware of the midnight tenders and the young male companions, yet they voluntarily, enthusiastically swallowed the Elizabeth Taylor bait whole. Why did they willingly participate in this grand-scale gaslighting? Because a fairy tale narrative about an eccentric billionaire sweeping a Hollywood legend off her feet sells millions of newspapers. It reinforces the comforting, aspirational capitalist status quo. Conversely, a nuanced, tragic investigation into a powerful, closeted man trapped by the homophobic architecture of his own financial empire was deemed too complex, too dark, and far too dangerous to print. The journalists actively chose the profitable illusion over the complex reality. They transformed themselves from objective observers into unpaid, highly effective security guards for his closet, happily cementing the bricks of his prison wall in exchange for exclusive photo opportunities and invitations to his lavish parties. The deepest, most unforgivable hypocrisy of this era, however, is found in the financial mechanics of their alliance. Malcolm Forbes began writing massive, highly publicized checks to Taylor's AIDS charity. He would stand on glittering stages in bespoke tuxedos, handing over $1 million at a time to AmFAR, basking in the rapturous applause of the conservative elite. He was publicly hailed as a titan of philanthropy, a compassionate hero stepping up to fight a terrible plague. Yet, underneath the tuxedo, his fatal flaw was dictating a horrific reality. He was financing the fight against the very disease that was currently ravaging his own hidden community, but he was doing it entirely for personal public relations. He used the tragedy of a marginalized, dying community as an expensive, glamorous prop to reinforce his own heterosexual disguise. Why? He signed those charity checks in public. He absolutely refused to utilize his immense, unparalleled political capital to enact actual change. He possessed a direct line to Ronald Reagan. He possessed the editorial control of a magazine that dictated policy to the American financial sector. He could have written a single editorial demanding government action, demanding empathy, demanding funding. He could have single-handedly shifted the conservative paradigm regarding the epidemic. Instead, he remained violently silent where it mattered most. To speak out politically, to demand systemic change, would be to risk drawing the establishment's eye towards his own private life. His terror of losing his seat at the pinnacle of power completely eclipsed any trace of human solidarity. He bought his own public absolution while allowing the system he helped build to continue its lethal neglect. This is the precise moment the contradiction becomes truly grotesque. He was a man who demanded the absolute privileges of the oppressor while secretly inhabiting the terrified reality of the oppressed. He believed that by funding Elizabeth Taylor's charity, he had successfully purchased a moral loophole. He convinced himself that his money absolved him of his silence. He was actively bankrolling the survival of his own secret demographic, but only on the strict condition that his name remained firmly attached to a Hollywood actress, rather than the grim reality of the hospital wards in Greenwich Village. It is a chilling case study in how immense wealth can completely distort a human being's moral compass, convincing them that reality itself is a commodity that can be negotiated, purchased, and controlled. The sheer success of the Elizabeth Taylor maneuver had a profound, ultimately disastrous psychological effect on Malcolm Forbes. It worked entirely too well. The media stopped asking questions. The rumors in the boardrooms were drowned out by the noise of the society pages. The conservative establishment embraced him more tightly than ever before, viewing his association with Taylor as the ultimate confirmation of his virility and status. This absolute triumph of public relations birthed a lethal arrogance. He began to believe his own engineered myth. He looked at the magazine covers, the television reports, and the fawning editorials, and he internalized the lie. He convinced himself that his wealth had literally made him a god, floating entirely above the consequences of truth or biology. He felt untouchable. The motorcycles, the hot air balloons, the yachts, and now the Hollywood icon. He had successfully built a fortress so massive, so blindingly bright, that he believed the darkness could never penetrate it. This intoxicating cocktail of limitless capital and total media submission eradicated his remaining caution. The fatal weakness, his insatiable hunger for validation, mutated from a defensive strategy into an aggressive, consuming hubris. He no longer just wanted to hide from the establishment. He wanted to force the establishment to cross oceans to worship him. By the late 1980s, the daily performance was no longer sufficient. The quiet dinners at the Rainbow Room and the stage photo ops on the Harley were losing their euphoric effect. He required a heavier dose of validation. He needed to construct a physical, undeniable monument to his own absolute power, a spectacle so deafeningly loud that it would echo across the globe and permanently cement his status as the unchallenged emperor of the capitalist dream. He set his sights away from the concrete canyons of Manhattan, looking across the Atlantic towards the sweeping arid landscapes of North Africa. He decided to throw a party, ostensibly a birthday celebration. This gathering served as the ultimate coronation of his fabricated reality, a $2.5 million defensive operation disguised as a festival. And this very habit of pushing the illusion to its absolute extra, vagant limits would set the stage for a spectacular fatal collision with the one force on earth that his billions could neither bribe, manipulate, nor outrun. The intoxicating, unprecedented success of the Elizabeth Taylor public relations maneuver profoundly altered the psychological architecture of Malcolm Forbes. As the 1980s drew to a close, he did not merely feel secure, he felt invincible. The media had surrendered, the conservative political establishment had fully embraced him, and the whispers regarding the midnight operations of the Highlander had been effectively drowned out by the roar of his custom-painted motorcycles. But this absolute triumph birthed a terrifying, ravenous monster of hubris. Invincibility is a demanding state of mind. It requires constant escalating proof. The quiet, strictly controlled environment of his super yachts and the stage photo opportunities in Manhattan were no longer sufficient to satiate his fatal weakness. The deep-seated pathological need for the establishment's validation had mutated. He no longer merely wanted to hide from the judgment of the American elite. He wanted to force the elite to physically cross oceans to worship at his feet. He required a spectacle so deafeningly loud, so globally dominant, that it would permanently cement his legacy as the unchallenged emperor of the capitalist dream, silencing not just the press but his own internal terrors. This desperate psychological hunger set the stage for the most audacious, expensive, and ultimately tragic defensive operation of his entire life. By early 1989, as he approached his 70th birthday, he decided to construct an undeniable physical monument to his own power. He looked away from the concrete canyons of Wall Street and set his sights on the sweeping, arid coastline of North Africa. He chose Tangier, Morocco. Historically, Tangier was a city of exiles, a shadowy haven for smugglers, spies, and outcasts. Yet Forbes chose to transform this city of secrets into the brightest, loudest focal point on earth. He owned the Palais Mendoub, a sprawling, magnificent estate overlooking the intersection of the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. He decided to host a birthday party, but to call it a party is a severe historical understatement. It was the coronation of a fabricated reality. It was a sovereign declaration of immunity. The logistics of this event revealed the staggering industrial scale of his desperation. He did not simply invite guests, he orchestrated the mass migration of the global power structure. He chartered a British Airways Concorde, a Boeing 747, and a DC-8 to ferry 800 of the world's most influential figures across the Atlantic. We are looking at a passenger manifest that served as the ultimate human shield. He flew in Henry Kissinger, Walter Cronkite, Barbara Walters, sitting governors, media magnates, and dozens of multinational chief executives. These people were not his intimate friends. They were the physical embodiment of the conservative American establishment. By forcing them to suspend their lives, board his private fleet of aircraft, and travel to a different continent solely to celebrate his existence, he was extracting the ultimate submission. He understood a fundamental rule of power. If the architects of the system are eating your caviar and drinking your vintage champagne in a Moroccan palace, they will never look inside your closet. He bought their complicity with unparalleled extravagance. The visual execution of the weekend in August 1989 was a masterpiece of blinding contradiction. He surrounded himself with a 200-strong guard of honor, explicitly granted by the King of Morocco from the royal army. He staged a massive, thundering cavalry charge of 600 Berber horsemen who fired their antique muskets into the air as the Concord elite watched in stunned silence. There were hundreds of belly dancers, fire eaters, and snake charmers. He erected a city of massive air-conditioned tents in the desert, serving roasted sheep and limitless alcohol to the titans of Wall Street. And at the center of this chaotic manufactured kingdom sat Malcolm Forbes himself. The physical manifestation of his performance here is deeply jarring. He abandoned his bespoke business suits and his leather biker jackets. He draped himself in a sweeping emerald green Moroccan velvet robe, sitting on a literal throne, receiving the elite like a conquering monarch. The cost of this single weekend was a staggering $2.5 million. But the true issue is not the financial expenditure. The true issue is the deafening psychological noise he was trying to generate. He paid $2.5 million simply to ensure he could not hear his own thoughts. Archival photographs of him on that throne reveal a stark contrast. Amidst the cheering crowds and exploding fireworks, he appeared as one of the most profoundly isolated men on the planet. He had successfully bought the attention of the world, yet there was not a single person in that sprawling palace who truly knew the man inside the velvet robe. The sheer scale of the party perfectly mirrored the sheer scale of his internal terror. The larger the guest list, the more real the lie had to feel to him. He was conducting a military-grade defensive operation disguised as a festival, burning millions of dollars under the North African sky to desperately convince himself that his armor was finally impenetrable. The consequences of his policies and his public posture render this Moroccan spectacle deeply, unforgivably hypocritical. While the fireworks exploded over Tangier in August 1989, back across the ocean in New York City, the AIDS crisis was reaching a terrifying, catastrophic peak. The very community he secretly belonged to, the young men who were ferried to his yacht in the dark, were dying in the thousands in overcrowded, underfunded hospital wards. Advocacy groups were desperately protesting in the streets, begging the conservative government for basic medical research funding. Yet, the high priest of capitalism, a man with unparalleled media influence and direct access to the White House, chose to remain violently silent. Instead of deploying his vast resources to challenge a lethal homophobic political system, he used his billions to fly the architects of that very system to Morocco for a weekend of belly dancers and roasted sheep. He fiddled extravagantly and loudly while his own community burned. He believed that his wealth had secured him an exclusive permanent seat in the lifeboats, completely indifferent to the drowning happening just out of frame. The Moroccan coronation was an absolute, unquestionable public relations triumph. The global media covered the event with breathless, fawning reverence, cementing his image as the ultimate eccentric billionaire patriarch. But the psychological toll of orchestrating this massive hallucination was severe. When the Concords flew back to New York, the tents were dismantled, and the Berber horsemen rode away. Malcolm Forbes had to return to the quiet, sterile reality of his Fifth Avenue office and the dark waters of the Hudson River. The autumn of 1989 and the winter of 1990 brought a chilling, unspoken dread. He had reached the absolute summit. There was no party bigger than Morocco. There was no celebrity more famous than Elizabeth Taylor. There was no motorcycle louder than the Harley. He had exhausted the global supply of distractions. The physical strain of maintaining two entirely separate realities, of constantly projecting aggressive alpha male dominance while simultaneously managing a highly classified shadow existence, was rapidly degrading the biological system of a 70-year-old man. The armor he had worn for decades was becoming impossibly heavy. He had successfully manipulated the media, manipulated the stock market, and manipulated the political establishment. But he was about to discover the one absolute truth that completely ignores wealth, status, and non-disclosure agreements. Biology cannot be bribed, and mortality does not read Forbes magazine. The collapse of the fortress did not begin with a loud explosion. It began with total, terrifying silence. On Saturday, the 24th of February, 1990, Malcolm Forbes was resting at Timberfield, his sprawling, heavily fortified estate in Far Hills, New Jersey. This was the domestic shield he had constructed decades earlier, the suburban home that provided the crucial foundational layer of his heterosexual family man disguise. Away from the flashing cameras of Manhattan and the grand theatrics of Morocco, the Emperor of Wall Street simply went to sleep. He suffered a massive, catastrophic heart attack. There were no reporters present. There was no roaring engine to drown out the reality. His biological system simply failed, and he died quietly in his bed. His sudden passing created an immediate vacuum of power. Within hours, the frantic phone calls began. The massive corporate machinery of Forbes Incorporated, designed for decades to aggressively promote and protect the image of its patriarch, slammed into high gear to manage the crisis of his passing. The crisis management was executed with flawless, ruthless efficiency. The family and the corporate executives immediately locked down the narrative. They presented the media with the exact story the establishment wanted to hear: the tragic, unexpected passing of an American titan, a decorated war hero, a visionary publisher, and a beloved family man. The days following his death were a masterclass in establishing a sanitized, unimpeachable legacy. The political and financial world rushed to build a monument to his memory. President George H.W. Bush issued a glowing public statement praising his entrepreneurial spirit and his unwavering dedication to American values. Former President Ronald Reagan mourned the loss of a great conservative champion. The titans of industry, the very men who had flown on his Concorde to Morocco 6 months earlier, filled the editorial pages with tributes to his rugged individualism and his masculine bravado. His funeral was orchestrated with the precision and grandeur of a state event. Held at the imposing St. Bartholomew's Church on Park Avenue in Manhattan, the service was attended by thousands. The street was lined with mourners, corporate executives, and members of his capitalist tools motorcycle club, who revved their heavy engines in a final loud salute to their fallen leader. Bagpipers played traditional Scottish dirges, honoring the strict immigrant father whose demands for aggressive masculinity had initially forged Malcolm's fatal weakness. The media coverage was universally reverent. They broadcast the image of the flag-draped coffin, solidifying the myth of the flawless, straight capitalist hero for eternity. The establishment looked at the grand funeral and believed the book on Malcolm Forbes was permanently, safely closed. And this is where the true terror of the situation begins to manifest. The executives in the boardroom and the mourners in the church believed that his legacy was secure, but they fundamentally misunderstood the mechanics of the fortress he had built. They believed his power lay in the magazine and his public image. They did not realize that the true power keeping his legacy intact was his daily, terrifying, active management of the shadows. For decades, the physical presence of Malcolm Forbes, the sheer intimidating weight of his personality and his wealth, had functioned as the keystone holding the entire architecture of secrecy together. He was the one who signed the massive checks. He was the one who enforced the strict protocols on the Highlander. He was the one who held the implicit threat of total financial and social ruin over the heads of the young men and the security personnel who inhabited his hidden world. Ath severed the financial lifelines that bought his silence. The checks stopped clearing, the non-disclosure agreements expired, and the witnesses were no longer intimidated. The moment his heart stopped beating in New Jersey, the millions of dollars sitting in his bank accounts instantly lost their ability to purchase silence. The highly paid security guards standing watch over the lower deck doors of the yacht suddenly had no employer to protect. The complex, highly compartmentalized network of discreet facilitators and young male companions were suddenly released from the gravitational pull of his massive wealth. The ironclad contracts of silence that he had spent his entire life and a significant portion of his fortune negotiating expired the exact second he drew his last breath. The corporate executives at Forbes believed they had successfully buried the man and cemented the myth. They had no idea that the locks on the doors of the Highlander had just been broken from the inside. They did not know that the silence he had bought was temporary, a mere rental agreement that had just tragically lapsed, while the conservative establishment continued to publish eulogies praising his traditional family values. A very different kind of journalistic machinery was already quietly humming into life, far away from the polished boardrooms of Wall Street. The fortress was completely undefended, and the people he had forced into the shadows were finally stepping out into the light, carrying the devastating blueprints of his perfect lie. The corporate executives on Fifth Avenue exhaled a collective sigh of relief, assuming the secret locked away in the restricted corridors of the Highlander had been permanently buried. They fundamentally misunderstood how secrets operate. When the massive capital funding their suppression evaporates. Without Malcolm's intimidating presence to actively enforce the illusion, the silence he had purchased quickly dissolved. The highly paid, secure ID guards and discreet facilitators were suddenly released from the gravitational pull of his wealth. The ironclad contracts of silence simply expired. This vulnerability was quickly exploited by Outweek magazine, a radical publication born in the crucible of the AIDS epidemic. Spearheaded by journalist Michelangelo Signorile, the staff viewed Forbes not as a closeted victim, but as the ultimate hypocrite, a billionaire who used his platform to validate a conservative regime that ignored a devastating health crisis. Bypassing the corporate lawyers, they tracked down the invisible workforce of the Highlander. The evidence they gathered dismantled every pillar of the Malcolm Forbes myth, meticulously mapping the financial mechanics of a billionaire's lifelong panic. In March 1990, Outweek published The Other Life of Malcolm Forbes. The exposure highlighted a profound contradiction. He demanded the privileges of the oppressor while secretly inhabiting the terrified reality of the marginalized. The mainstream media, having eagerly swallowed his public relations stunts for decades, panicked. Instead of addressing the staggering political implications, major newspapers aggressively debated the ethics of outing, desperately attempting to mask their own decades-long journalistic failure. The impenetrable shield of capital had failed, breached permanently by a magazine printed on cheap paper. Ultimately, the grand physical props of Malcolm's performance were quietly liquidated. The custom hot air balloons were packed away. The fleet of Harley-Davidsons disappeared from the corporate garages. The collection of Imperial Fabergé eggs, perhaps the most fitting metaphor for a flawlessly crafted but hollow existence, was sold privately to a Russian oligarch for over $100 million. Inside the Forbes family, the psychological fallout was severe. Steve Forbes, inheriting both the empire and the scandal, spent the following decade attempting to politically cleanse the family name. Pouring over $60 million into 2 presidential campaigns, he ran on a strict platform of traditional family values, fiercely courting the very conservative factions that had forced his father into the shadows. Malcolm Forbes was shaped by a brutal mid-century ecosystem that demanded the surrender of the authentic self for a seat in the boardroom. He learned those rules with devastating perfection, using extreme symbols of American machismo to build an impenetrable armor. When the music finally stopped and the checkbook snapped shut, all that remained was the quiet tragedy of a man who spent a fortune to ensure the world never truly knew him.